You've probably noticed something about the men in your life crossing 50, something hard to name. Maybe it's your father, maybe it's your brother, maybe it's you, looking back at yourself from some distance. They stop saying, "I'm sorry," not out of coldness, not because they've become distant or lost their kindness. It's more subtle than that. It's as if somewhere between 45 and 55, an equation in their head finally got solved. And once the answer shows up, there's no going back to how things were. A Gen X man past 50 doesn't stop apologizing because he stopped caring about other people. He stops apologizing because he finally started caring about himself. Before we go further, if this is already touching on something familiar, take a second to subscribe to Labyrinth Psychology. This is where we explore the psychology quietly shaping who we become. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. For decades, Gen X men were trained to apologize as a reflex. Apologize for being late. Apologize for expressing an emotion that made someone else uncomfortable. Apologize for disagreeing. Apologize for wanting something for themselves. The words, "I'm sorry," didn't always mean they'd actually done something wrong. Often, it was just a tool to keep the peace, to make sure no one got upset, to let things pass smoothly. They learned early that the role of a dependable man was to manage the emotional temperature of the whole room, not just his own. I knew a man named Gary who worked as a warehouse manager for 27 years. He was the kind of guy who was always first to say, "I'm sorry," during a family disagreement, even when he wasn't the one in the wrong. His wife counted on that. His kids saw it as admirable steadiness. Co-workers saw him as easy to work with because he never let conflict drag on. But at 51, one evening, his daughter called complaining about how her husband was treating her unfairly, and out of old habit, Gary was about to say, "I'm sorry you have to go through that," the way he always did to smooth things over. But this time, he stopped mid-sentence. He realized he was about to apologize for something he had nothing to do with, hadn't caused, and had no control over. He told his daughter, "I'm not sorry, because this isn't my fault, but I'm here if you need me to listen." Nothing dramatic happened after that call. But inside Gary, a door had quietly closed, the door of taking responsibility for things that were never his to carry. Gen X men grew up during a very particular cultural squeeze. Their fathers were the tail end of the silent generation and early baby boomers, men who treated independence as the default, who didn't burden others, who solved their own problems. Gen X was the latchkey generation, taught early that no one was coming to save them. Then the culture shifted. They grew up, and suddenly men were expected to be different, emotionally available, willing to listen, quick to apologize when needed, able to make peace. They were sold the idea that the old model of masculinity was broken and that the new model meant holding everything together at once. So they learned to split themselves in half. They got good at apologizing to keep the peace at home while still being the steady rock at work. They became skilled at managing other people's impressions of them, always the first to yield, always the one smoothing things over, even when, underneath, they didn't actually agree. For 40 years, that worked. But somewhere around 50, something shifts that nobody really explains. Part of it is biological. Cortisol recalibrates. Testosterone changes. The body's tolerance for constant performance drops, not because they're getting weaker, but because a system that ran on adrenaline for decades starts asking for something different. The brain stops running in constant performance mode and starts asking questions it had been too busy to ask before. What am I actually apologizing for? Am I really in the wrong, or am I just doing what I've always done to keep everything calm? I have a friend named Alan who worked in insurance for 23 years. Alan was always the one to apologize first in any argument with his wife, even when he wasn't sure what exactly he'd done wrong. He did it because, to him, keeping the peace mattered more than being right. The year Alan turned 53, his company went through layoffs. He was offered an early retirement package. During the week he spent deciding, his wife kept saying he should fight to keep his position, that he should prove his worth. And out of old habit, Alan almost apologized for making her worry, but this time he just said, "I'm not sorry, because this is my decision, and I need time to think about what I actually want, not what makes everyone around me feel reassured." He took the package. A few months later, he started teaching woodworking for free to teenagers in the neighborhood. He told me the thing that surprised him most wasn't the decision to leave his job. It was the relief of finally not having to apologize for living life on his own terms. Here's what society often gets wrong about these men. When a man stops apologizing for things that aren't his fault, people tend to call it coldness, stubbornness, or a midlife crisis. But it isn't a crisis. It's an awakening. It's the moment a man realizes that for decades, he'd been confusing keeping the peace with abandoning himself. Apologizing constantly, even when he'd done nothing wrong, was never really kindness. It was a form of quietly erasing himself, disguised as a virtue. A man who knows when to apologize and when not to isn't harder to be around. He's more trustworthy, because when his apology does come, it actually means something, instead of just being a reflex to diffuse the moment. If you belong to this generation, or if you're watching this happen in the man in your own life, maybe what's going on isn't that he's becoming more distant or difficult. Maybe he's simply learning, for the first time in decades, how to tell the difference between real responsibility and the habit of taking blame just to keep things comfortable for everyone else. That isn't selfishness. It's what psychology sometimes calls boundary restoration, the process of reclaiming the line between what actually belongs to you and what other people have quietly placed on your shoulders over the years. Gen X men past 50 don't stop apologizing because they stopped caring. They stop apologizing because they finally learned to tell the difference between genuine kindness and a lifelong habit of making themselves smaller, a habit they never actually agreed to carry in the first place. If this video touched on something you've felt but never had words for, share your story in the comments. And if you know a Gen X man who needs to hear this, send it to him. Don't forget to subscribe to Labyrinth Psychology, because every week we uncover the quiet truths that have shaped who we are.